Last time we met, we were talking about how to categorize different policies. And one of the ways that we did that was by looking at who pays for something and who benefits for something. Remember, we had diffuse costs and concentrated benefits. That's one way of looking at policy, who wins and who loses. There are other ways. And so in this video, we're going to take a slightly different approach, and we're going to be looking at different policy arenas. In other words, what is the intended purpose of the policy? We're going to be spending a lot of time talking about how the government spends money. And we're going to be looking at some of the biggest sources of spending in the federal budget every year. We're going to be looking at things like Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and other types of spending. And that's really going to be the primary focus of our video this time. So some of the things that we're going to talk about are these ideas about social welfare policies. Now, when we talk about social welfare, we're talking about ways that the government can help people who are maybe high need. And so we're going to be looking at this concept of the social safety net and what that means. We're also going to be exploring a few different entitlement programs. So you're going to be familiar with that term as well. Things like Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, these are big sources of government spending. Those three programs account for about half of the government spending every single year. So they're really big and they're really important. We're also going to be spending a little bit less time, but still focusing on things like funding for science and technology, funding for education, kind of considerations that the government has to make when it comes to business policies. And so really that's going to be the overview of our video. Instead of looking at who wins and who loses, we're going to sort of be looking at policy through the lens of why are we spending this money? What is the purpose? Or what is the purpose of this policy in the case of some policies where we don't spend anything? So let's jump right in, and we're going to start off with this concept right here, social welfare. So most of the government spending that we have today is going to be for social welfare. And these are going to be policies that help to provide basic needs. Everybody has certain needs, right? I mean, we all need housing, we all need food, we all need shelter. There's all kinds of things that we need to live a healthy and successful life. So we have this concept in our country and in most countries around the world of this idea of the social safety net. Now you see a picture of a safety net here. And if you've ever worked on a construction site, especially if you're working high up off the ground, you'll know that there are safety nets put around those construction sites. Because if you're working really high up and you fall off, you don't want to fall stories down and hit the ground. There's going to be a net there that's going to catch you. And so when we talk about social safety net, we're kind of talking about that same concept, except for the economy. Something could happen to you at any moment. You could get in some sort of a terrible accident that causes you to be unable to work. You, for no fault of your own, could lose your job. Maybe something happens in the broader economy or with your company, and all of a sudden you're laid off, you've got bills to pay, and you don't have any money to do that. So one of the biggest sources of spending in our society is on this social safety net. We have an economic safety net where if somebody gets hurt, if somebody gets injured, if somebody is permanently disabled or they lose their job, they're not going to be out on the streets more often than not. There's going to be some programs that can help to take care of them, to catch them when they fall, so that there's no permanent, lifelong, in the case of this construction worker, if the net wasn't there, what would happen? He'd die. We want to avoid that for people because we recognize that there are some things that are just out of our control in life. And so this is going to be a really major source of government spending. We're going to look today in this video at a few different programs. We're going to call those entitlement programs. If you're entitled to something, that means it's yours. You should get it. You should receive it. An entitlement program is essentially a program that guarantees certain types of benefits to specific groups in our population. And if you meet the requirements, you're basically guaranteed to be able to participate in that program. So we're going to look at three entitlement programs in particular: Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. So why don't we dive into the first one? The photo that you see here was taken during the Great Depression. If you look closely, what do you see? You see a bunch of men. They're all lined up. They're going into this building, and it says free soup, coffee, and donuts for the unemployed. Now, that's a lot of people who are unemployed right there. What's going on? Well, some of you know that during the Great Depression, we had a really severe economic crisis in the United States. This happened starting in late 1929, but it stretched on for much of the 1930s. And you saw banks collapse. People had put their savings in the bank, and the bank went out of business, and now they lost their money. You saw the stock market completely collapse, lose all kinds of value. So a lot of people lost tremendous amount of money there. What did that mean for average, everyday people? It meant the economy was terrible. About 23% of Americans were completely out of work. And this was at a time when there really was not a government social safety net in the United States. The vast majority of spending when it came to helping the poor, helping people who had, basically fallen hard on their luck, were things like churches and religious organizations and charities. There really was not much of a role for the national government in this. So, starting in the Great Depression, we're going to see some really major changes, especially at the federal government level, where you've got the national government stepping in and trying to help people who've been affected by the Great Depression. There was a lot of different ways that they did that. One of the biggest ways was this program that we're going to refer to right now as Social Security. About 3 years into the Great Depression, the man that you see sitting here, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, was elected as president of the United States. And when he came in as president, he essentially guaranteed or promised, he made it one of his real major priorities, was to start addressing some of the fallout from the Great Depression, how to help average Americans, everyday working Americans. And he passed this whole series of bills called the New Deal. So Roosevelt's New Deal program, it included all kinds of different things. It included putting people to work on construction projects, doing these big building projects to expand electricity to people who lived out in rural areas, giving relief for people who'd lost their jobs. But one of the biggest ones was this idea of the Social Security program. So we're going to look at Social Security right now. Now, Social Security is one of the biggest costs for the United States government today. About $1 trillion every year is spent on the Social Security program. And what it does is it's intended to help elderly people, senior citizens. It's one of the biggest types of social welfare policy that we have in the country, certainly one of the most expensive. And the goal is really, how do we help people who have worked their entire lives, who've gotten to the age of retirement, and they're unable to work, or maybe they have a difficulty working? How do we support those people? Many of you, if you have elderly parents or if you have elderly grandparents, you may know people that are already taking part in Social Security. The way that this works is that if you're a senior citizen and you're over the age of 67 years old, you're going to qualify for some type of government paycheck every month. A lot of people are familiar with the idea of having some sort of a pension or retirement plan where as you're working, you're kind of paying in and saving up. Maybe you're investing in the stock market. And then later, when you go to retire, you have this kind of pot of money that's been saved up that you can personally draw upon. Nobody else can touch it. Now, that's not the model of Social Security at all. In fact, the way Social Security works is any of you really who are working right now, maybe you're working a job, you're going to see on your paycheck every time you get paid, you're paying Social Security. About 12.4% of your paycheck is going to fund the Social Security program. They're not putting it in a savings account waiting for you to retire. What they're doing is they're using that money and they're giving it to people who are already at retirement age, people who are already in their old age. And so there's 3 different ways that this happens. Okay, so as you're paying that money in, here's how the money is being spent. Number 1, if you are 67 years old or older, you're getting that guaranteed paycheck from the government every month that's kind of based on how much you made while you were working. If you made a lot, you get more. If you made a little bit during your working years, you get a little bit less. There's a couple other things that it does too. One of those things is going to be disability benefits. If you, as an adult or a child, you have a considerable disability that really impacts your quality of life and your ability to work, you are going to be potentially eligible for some type of payment as well. If you're disabled, it can be very difficult to go out and work. And so this is a way for people who get injured, who are disabled, to still be able to have a living wage. Now, finally, we have one for surviving family members, And this was really important, especially when this policy was passed in the 1930s. Oftentimes, there was a single breadwinner in the family. You had typically the male going out into the workforce and, bringing money home to the wife and kids, right? Especially at that time, women really hadn't entered the workforce like we see today. And so, what happens if somebody gets killed? Maybe they die either on the job or, they get sick, something happens. Well, that's going to be a really very challenging thing for their family economically. That's going to lead them into direct poverty. And so, in some circumstances, even up to this day, if a spouse dies or if a parent dies, the surviving spouse and the surviving children can likely get some money from the Social Security program too. Are you seeing that concept of it being like a safety net? Okay, something happens to you, either old age, you're no longer physically able to work, or you get disabled, or you have a tragedy. You're going to get caught by that safety net. You're going to get some money so you're not just destitute out on the streets, totally broke. That's Social Security. So that was passed in the 1930s. And about 30 years later, in the 1960s, you're going to see this next phase of really expanding the federal government's role in terms of, this money that's spent on programs assisting the poor, assisting people that are, potentially economically vulnerable. And that's going to be called the Great Society Program. The president that you see here in the middle, he's looking down, signing a paper. That's Lyndon Johnson. Okay, Lyndon Johnson, one of his main goals in the Great Society Program was to eliminate poverty and eliminate racial injustice in the United States. And so there are going to be some major types of spending priorities that are passed around this time. Things addressing education. So this is around the time you started to see the Head Start program for preschool students and the government funding those kind of opportunities. You're going to see other issues addressing poverty, things like food stamps. And one of the most significant things that you're going to see is beginning to expand access to medical care as well for the elderly and for people who are low income. And so those are two of the programs that we're going to look at now. Okay, so we just looked at a program, Social Security, that's primarily intended for older Americans, for senior citizens. Now, the next program that I'm going to talk about is also intended for that same group. When I talk about Medicare, I'm guessing most of the students watching this video right now, they're probably kind of younger in age. They're probably not senior citizens. If there are any seniors among us, I welcome you. I'm glad you're here. You probably already know about this. Medicare is for senior citizens. So just like Social Security was for seniors, Medicare is also for seniors. Except what it's doing now is instead of just, getting that paycheck coming in each month to really help economically, what you're seeing now is you're going to get some help when it comes to your medical expenses. We all know that medical bills can be very expensive. Seeing a doctor, getting medical help when you need it, it's not cheap. And when you're a senior citizen living on a fixed income, it can be even more difficult. And so the government set up this Medicare program during the 1960s. And what it does is it gives seniors and retirees access to low-cost health care. Most Americans get their health care from work. Okay, I go into work and my employer, the LA Community College District, they pay for my health care, which is great. I really like that. Someday I'm going to be a retiree, God willing, and I'm going to need help, but I'm not going to be employed anymore. I'm not going to have an employer. So for people who have, retired, they're no longer getting that health care through their job, they're going to qualify for Medicare once they reach a certain age. And it's going to do a couple of things. First, it's going to help people if they need to be hospitalized. It's going to help somebody if they need to go see their doctor. And there's also help when it comes to prescription drugs. So if you need medication, you can get help from the government to bring those costs down significantly. So these programs, Social Security and Medicare, are incredibly important for a lot of senior citizens. And they really rely on this help from the federal government. But one of the biggest criticisms about Social Security and Medicare has to do with the way that they're funded. So a few moments ago, I told you that the way these programs are funded is basically for everybody who's working right now, they're going to be paying into whoever's retired. You're going to be paying for those benefits out of your payroll taxes. Well, the demographics in America are changing. People are living longer and they're having fewer kids. And so what you see is that the costs of these programs grow over time, and there are fewer workers who are there to support them. So, for instance, when it comes to Social Security, back in 1950, for every person who was supported by the Social Security program, you had about 16 people who were out there in the workforce paying into the program. As of recent years, that number has fallen to about 2.8 people. So for every retiree, there's about 3 people out there working. And that trend is expected to actually go down even further over time. So there are real serious concerns about the way that these programs are going to be funded going into the future. There are some estimates that say in about a decade from now that we're not going to be taking in enough taxes to really help pay for these programs. So that's just one area of concern that's going to have to be addressed at some point. Now, these programs are not just for senior citizens. We talk about social welfare programs. Seniors are one very important group, but there's another very important group that needs help as well, and those are low income Americans. And medical issues, being able to access a doctor, being able to access medical services, that's incredibly important for low income Americans as well, many of whom go and if they're working, maybe they don't even qualify for medical insurance from their jobs. And so the Medicaid system was also implemented around the same time in the 1960s. Medicaid is going to be the largest source of medical help for low-income Americans. Something like 74 million low-income Americans, about 23% of the American population, participate in Medicaid. They get their health benefits from the Medicaid program. This program is going to be kind of a collaboration between the national government and the state governments. So, here in the state of California, for instance, the federal government's paying a lot of Medicaid, but the California government is also chipping in. Together, they're going to be working to support low-income Americans so that they have some access to healthcare services. So these 3 programs we just looked at, Social Security, which I believe is over $1 trillion a year in spending. Medicare is nearly $1 trillion every year, and Medicaid is over $600 billion a year. You take these 3 programs, and they account for nearly half of the national government's spending every single year. Now, it doesn't matter, what they're spending it on: education, healthcare, the military. Add up all the spending. These 3 programs account for about half of that spending every year. So really significant. A lot of money's going into these programs, which is also leading to a lot of debt. So what this graph shows you over time is the growing debt, in the United States. It peaked, around World War II. And then when the financial crisis started in about 2008, we saw those debt levels going up again. In other words, the government's borrowing money to pay for some of these programs. And the Congressional Budget Office was saying, hey, once that pandemic hits, we're expected to see that national debt continue to rise quite a bit. In a future video, we'll talk about the difference between the debt and the deficit. But this is one of the ways that the government pays for some of these programs, is by taking out debt in order to do it. We're going to talk about that a little bit more in a future video. Okay, so we talked about, these 3 really important programs that look at retirees, senior citizens, healthcare. There are other ways that the government spends money. Now, one of these ways is research, and a lot of this research really ramped up in right around the same period of time, the 1960s. During the Cold War, we had this conflict with the Soviet Union, and it was really going to be a matter of who had the best technology. The United States wanted to make sure that we had the best military in the world, that we had the most cutting-edge science, and so the federal government began funding scientific endeavors as a result of that. A lot of that money was spent towards research and development for military equipment. And that research for the military still continues to this day. We're still trying to find new ways of ensuring the defense of the United States, having the most capable military, the most capable weapons. Some money is spent on civilian purposes, though. So, for instance, you'll see a lot of money being spent for things like the National Science Foundation, funding different kinds of scientific research studies. You also see things like the National Institutes of Health, so doing research into medicine, medical practices. Of course, during the COVID pandemic, we saw a ton of federal money that was spent in terms of studying the coronavirus and trying to come up with a vaccine. So you did see that. You see the federal government spending money on the space program. We've all seen this footage of, rockets blasting off and going to the moon, sending rovers to Mars, exploring really our solar system and the universe. So a lot of that scientific research, a lot of that funding is going to come from the federal government. Now, when it comes to education, typically this has been kind of the role of the state. So each of the states will really fund their local K-12. They're going to fund their colleges and universities. The federal government does also spend money on education. A lot of that is in the form of things like student loans, grants, work-study programs. If any of you have ever filled out the FAFSA before, you're going to be familiar with this because maybe you got that Pell Grant. That's going to be money from the national government that's coming to help you. And, the state government provides some of that too. If you got a Cal Grant, that's money from the state of California. So there is a lot of money that's spent as well on education. Now, the last thing that we're going to talk about in this video is really this balancing act that the government has. So you can kind of think of this as balancing on one side concerns around economic growth with concerns around regulation. So regulation is when government puts laws and different policies on businesses that they have to do something. And usually the reason why this is people want to feel that they're safe, that they're not going to be hurt by somebody's business practices. Maybe they're using a cheap product, or maybe they're damaging the local environment because their factory is spewing out all of these emissions. So the government does regulate businesses. The government tells the business, this is what you are allowed to do, what you have to do, what you're not allowed to do. Okay, and so some of the reasons we have that is to ensure things like worker safety. You have federal agencies like OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, who make sure that things are safe on people's work sites, that they're not going to be going into work and dying or getting injured unnecessarily. You have the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, that's looking at the practices around handling food, making sure that our food is safe, it's not going to get us sick when we eat it. You have things like the Environmental Protection Agency that tells different companies, here's what you can do so that you're not overly damaging the environment. So you have these regulations in place to kind of help protect that. Now, there can be a downside. If you put too many regulations in place, like I said, it's a balancing act. Too many regulations in place, you're going to miss out on economic growth. And you might be wondering, well, why does economic growth matter? It matters a lot. If you have a job, you have to, that's from the economy. So you have to recognize that if there's a slowdown in economic growth, a lot of people are going to be losing their jobs. They're going to be losing that food off of the, the dinner table, or they're going to be really struggling to make ends meet. So you want to make sure that you have a strong economy. It's not just important for people and for their jobs, it's also important for the government, because remember, the government is taking in money through taxes. If people are not out there working, you're not getting payroll taxes. If people are too afraid to spend their paycheck because they don't know when the next one's coming, they're not going to be spending money, and you're not going to be getting those sales taxes, okay? So the government actually has an interest in making sure that the economy is strong and healthy, because they're also getting tax revenues from that. And it, honestly makes our country stronger overall, economically, militarily. And so there's a really big incentive. So the government is always sort of playing this balancing act, making sure there's not too much regulation to where the economy suffers and crashes, and making sure that there is not too little where it's just kind of a free-for-all and people are doing whatever they want, damaging the environment and, damaging workers and so forth. So I hope you found this interesting. We covered a few different things in this video. The key things I want you to take away are definitely an understanding of Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, who those programs serve, and some of the other ways that government provides spending on some of these important policy issues. I'll see you at the next video. We've got more coming up this week, and I'll look forward to seeing you then.